What I got to thinking about this week, once again, has me trying to take stock of what I am seeing in public life and reconcile these feelings that erupt in me to what my faith teaches me. And where I have to begin is with something I've talked about before, so I'll do a quick recap. A man named John Gottman, I teach his work in a lot of my classes. He's a marriage and family therapist, lives up in Washington, and he says that there are 4 communication patterns that if they show up in a marriage, they're a sign that the marriage is in deep trouble, and he calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And they are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. And he always says of the 4, contempt is the worst. When you put yourself on a higher plane and someone else on a lower plane, then that relationship is just not long for this world. And I started this off 30 however many weeks ago, saying to myself, I think that the Christian's version of I think therefore I am, the Christian's version of the toehold that you can't sink below without just closing your Bible and saying I'm done with this, the one fundamental is it's not okay to hate. It is absolutely not okay to hate. And if it's not okay to hate, it's also not okay to express contempt. I mean, Jesus says it a bunch of times that if God has forgiven you, you have to forgive everybody, anything that they do. And I've talked about this before. I have been set free from infinite offense, so any offense anyone can commit against me is less than that. And I therefore have absolutely no freedom to hold anything against anyone. By that reasoning, I also have absolutely no freedom, no license to hold anyone in contempt, because God is in the perfect position to hold me in contempt. It actually would make perfect sense for God to hold me in contempt. Virtually no other position, virtually no other opinion of His makes any sense at all. I mean, it could be said that the gospel really doesn't make any sense, that I am contemptible to God, but God chooses to love me instead. And that move, I should freeze right there and say, every time I find myself holding someone else in contempt, I should stop and say, God ought to hold me in contempt, but He chooses to love me. So whenever I feel in danger of putting someone else below me, lower than me, I should follow God's example and love them. But it's easier said than done. This, of course, is the week that President Trump decided the best use of his time was to lash out against professional football players because of how they take a knee during the national anthem to protest shootings around the country and other issues as well having to do with race relations. And what I can't get away from, I mean, the Bible teaches me that it's perfectly okay to laud wisdom when I see it, to look up to people who are wise, to seek out the counsel of people who are wise. And it seems as though at least parts of the Bible point me in the direction of it being okay to call someone a fool. Proverbs calls people fools left and right. That half the book seems to be about the characteristics of a fool. And if I am being tuned to recognize a fool when I see one, I have a hard time believing that I'm not permitted to look at Donald Trump after his recent string of decisions and say, Donald John Trump is a fool. Now, the rub is, as I say that, am I holding him in contempt? You know, Jesus said in Matthew 5:22 that if I call someone you fool, I am in danger of hellfire. He says that in the context of it being no different from murdering someone in my heart. But the puzzle becomes, can I recognize that someone is a fool and not hate them for it? Can my decision to identify someone as a fool, to put that label on someone else, could that purely be my reading, the best reading I can come up with from the evidence presented to me? And can I call someone a fool and yet at the same time recognize them as a fellow sinner in need of God's grace, potentially a brother in Christ. I know there are some very politically active clergy who say that he is. I'm skeptical. I haven't seen fruit of it in his life. But, I have lenses over my eyes that if he were taking his first wobbly steps as a believer, I probably would blind myself to them out of the same motivated reasoning I accuse everybody else of. But if Jesus also says, don't cast your pearls before swine, and encourages those who follow him to tell the difference, to know that some people are swine, is it inevitable? Is it the necessary outcome that if I say President Trump is behaving like a fool, am I in danger of hellfire, as Jesus said in Matthew 5:22? Or was he warning that when you say that as an expression of hatred, that's what's unacceptable? Is it contemptuous if it's not driven by hatred? If I can disentangle myself from the hatred, and I can just make the most reasonable judgment from the quality of the behavior, even if I liked President Trump, even if his politics matched mine completely, if he behaved in this way, I would still see little choice but to call him a fool. And if that's true, then could it be the case that that's no longer contemptuous? Or am I rationalizing? And there's a big part of me that worries that what I'm trying to do is put a nice white coat of paint, another one of Jesus' references, a nice whitewash on top of my behavior. But then I worry, if you turn the issue around the other direction, that if I'm not allowed to call Donald Trump, President Trump, a fool after the most recent set of events, then it seems as though I have to be completely decoupled from reality. Or I have to say to myself things are dishonest. Not necessarily that he's a wise man. The Bible doesn't say that you have to call everyone wise. As a matter of fact, it makes it fairly clear you ought to recognize wisdom as distinct from just the everyday. But to even call him everyday, ordinary, average in the quality of his decisions, it seems to me as being dishonest. So does biblical teaching force me to ignore what's almost impossible to ignore? It's a hard thing. And really, I've told myself from the beginning, it's not about him. He is who he's always been. It really is about what happened in the shift in voter attitudes and voter expectations and people who participate in public life to where they still feel loyalty for him. So the real question, and the one that I'm not engaging terribly effectively, is, can I call his supporters fools without feeling contempt for them? Fool is a difficult, it's a problematic word. It's the negation of wisdom. It is a person who not only has no wisdom, but has the mirror image of wisdom, has judgment and patterns of decision-making that are destructive, that make things worse, not better. And there are people in the world for whom that's true, and you can say that of them and not hate them. Young children are foolish. Young children, while they are growing into the abilities of their brains and while they're acquiring experience and teaching about the world, until that process reaches a certain critical mass, young children are fools. And there are also special needs people, no shortage of them. They are very lovable. They can be included as beloved family members, beloved members of the community, but they need a little bit of help in reasoning through things and making decisions, and the law even recognizes this. It's very unkind and very demeaning and very corrosive of their dignity to apply the label fool to them. But if you think of judgment and decision-making as a spectrum with wise at one end and foolish at the other end, you have to say that they're closer to the foolish end than to the wise end. So then, do I just say that Trump supporters are all in some sense special needs? Does that become another step in the direction of taking all the words that we've tried to coin for that population and to see them all turn into insults? The most recent, when I was a child, people who had Down syndrome, people who had other developmental delays, you referred to them as retarded because retardation just meant a slowing down. I remember when I took music lessons, retardando was slowing down. And so retarded just meant slow. And of course, someone had to adopt it as slang for stupid, which I've always found deeply loathsome. And whenever I hear someone say about an idea, that's retarded, I take an instant dislike to that person. But it's the kind of thing that happens. Every term that we try to apply to developmentally delayed special needs populations, eventually it gets turned into an insult. And I don't know how to match this up with what I've observed over the years, what I've read over the years about taboos. But it is taboo, but it's right on the edge of a taboo. It's not such a dangerous taboo that it can get people excluded from polite company or put their jobs in danger, so they'll play around with a taboo. It's not okay to insult people who have a disability, but it is okay if the disability involves intelligence, and maybe it's not even okay, but it's almost okay. So if I were to say, well, my political opponents and those who support the current occupant of the Oval Office, they remind me in some sense of special needs people because they have some sort of pathology, some sort of breakdown with their perception and decision making. So in some sense, the way they reason about public life is foolish. But is there a way that I can point that out, which seems inescapably obvious to me, without saying it in a spirit of hate? Because my faith doesn't allow me to say that in a spirit of hate. Jesus gave some of his most dire warnings against using that kind of language to refer to anyone. So I'm stuck between thinking I'm rationalizing what clearly ought to be impermissible behavior on the one hand, and on the other hand thinking, but don't cast your pearls before swine, and all the teaching through Proverbs about recognizing fools and not following them. And really, I don't think the Bible has ever compelled me to disregard reality. I don't think the Bible has ever tried to coerce me to lie. And I have to think that an interpretation of a scriptural command that said that I have to say or even think things that are false to fact, there must be a misinterpretation in there somewhere. So I want to be true to what my faith teaches me, and I want to walk in obedience. And I want to get the actual issue of what's wrong with the leadership and with the voters who support that leader. I want to get that disentangled from my anger and my anxiety, because it's really more anxiety than it is anger. It just manifests as anger. I want to get those pulled apart from one another. I've wanted from the very beginning not to think of people who did this and continue to provide support for this. I don't want to think of them as my enemies. And I don't want these eruptions in me where I want to see bad things happen to them and I want them to suffer, especially when it looks like decisions are coming out of the executive branch of the United States federal government that are going to adversely affect Trump's own voting bloc. And part of me thinks, well, you did this to yourself. I hope you learned something from it. But that's not the way you restore people. That's not the way that you reach out and include people in your community and value them as your neighbors. So can I pin down what it is that's going on? And can I have it free from anger, free from hatred, but also free from condescension? That is a needle that I have not yet figured out how to thread.